Well, hello there. You're aware by now of some ingredients of my vision for a transformed school system. So we'll put all the pieces together and add some in this lecture. And hopefully we'll discuss them this Thursday. This is one of the longer modules. So we'll get through probably most of it on Thursday, but there'll be a big chunk of it left for next week. So this week there'll be this Sunday you have off. Sort of. No essay due this Sunday midnight, and no homework due Monday midnight. Not today, Monday, but October 27th, Monday. No homework due as normal, but the week after that, back on schedule, back on doing things every week. Sunday, essay answer due. Monday midnight, a multiple choice homework assignment due. All right, so we'll spend a little bit of time here working into prescribing exactly what I think should be done. And again, the reason for this is not to brainwash you into believing. I know that's not possible anyway. You're all independent thinking folks, and that's the way it should be here in the marketplace of ideas. The idea here is to put forth with some passion, which makes it a little more interesting, exactly what I think about this and why I think it. And you should be the assertive individual that you are and say, hold the phone, Doc. If that's how you feel, don't hold back. I mean, that's why we're here. That's why we're doing what we're doing, to gain some insight on the right and wrong way to do things. And of course, in many cases, there may be more than one right or wrong way to do things, depending on how you weigh the trade-offs that exist between the various possible ways to go. So intelligent people can, and I can guarantee you do, disagree on what the end result should be and how to get there. All right, so here we go with our first slide, which has some further disclaimers on it. You can see there at the bottom that it's very important to keep in mind that a lot of this stuff, especially if you're thinking direct evidence, tried it before, it's somewhere else, and we know how it works. There's not a lot of that. Now, let me make a quick differentiation here in terms of this notion of evidence. If we're thinking of a different way to teach something, well, we can try that out in the lab. A different curriculum, a different textbook, whether to have small classes or large classes, we can try that out in the lab, and we can develop evidence before we implement it somewhere. But if you're talking about what we need to talk about, the gardening approaches, the different ways to set up classrooms. By setting up classrooms, I don't mean configure actual rooms, but I mean set up how school operators can decide what to do and how to do it. School funding and governance policies, the things that underlie the ability and decision making that goes into the way classrooms will operate. With funding and governance, it's very difficult to say we can't do anything, and well, we won't do anything until we have evidence to back it up, to know that, but because, why is that? Well, because that means somebody else, and a bunch of somebody else's probably will have had to have tried it for a long period first. So that's just your pure bureaucratic thinking that says, well, we can't move forward until we have evidence. And well, evidence means that somebody else will have to try it. So that means no one can ever be the first to try anything, which means that nothing can move forward. So you have to be entrepreneurial sometimes. And what does entrepreneurial mean in this instance? It means to take indirect evidence, for example, how markets function in other industries, and say, look, there's not any reason for K through 12 why markets can't function at a higher level. Yes, schooling is different. We've gone over some of those reasons. But on balance, it doesn't seem, see, the seem means you're not relying on direct evidence. It doesn't seem like it would work badly, and it seems in many ways that it ought to work awfully well. Okay, so yes, the specific evidentiary support for a lot of these elements of an overall vision for a school system is pretty thin. Again, especially if you think in terms of direct evidence, specifically having tried it somewhere else before for a long time. But, as it says under point B there on that first slide, sure, it'd be great to have more evidence. Sure, it would be great for somebody else's to have tried it first, and if there are any mistakes to be made, to learn from their mistakes rather than your own. But that's not always possible, and we have to weigh the value of somehow generating evidence or discovering it somewhere else in the world against the cost of staying where you are, sticking with the status quo, which we know is a nation at risk status quo. We have to weigh the value of more and better evidence against the cost of waiting to have it. For example, 6 legislative sessions is another cohort of K through 12 children. 6 legislative sessions is all it takes for another set of children to go from beginning through end through a system that I've argued is largely dysfunctional and performs at a low level because one size doesn't fit all and other roots of the problem as well. All right, so here we have our list of readings. Remember, you have 2 weeks to get after it this time. Now notice the first reading there, it's a 50-state overview of what's legal, one state at a time. So pick 1 or 2 states to get a hang of it, get the feel for it, and maybe read the overview at the beginning. I don't expect you to read the whole thing, although by all means, if you feel like you want to, and the opportunity cost in terms of reading other stuff, less of other stuff isn't too severe, by all means, read the whole thing. So there we have some longer readings, and once again, I beg, plead, request that some of you adopt those and then post a somewhat extensive summary in our discussion forums, and that way we can get everybody aware of the main points in each one of them without having to find the time to read them all ourselves, though once again, I would sure love it if you could all find the time to do that. And then we have some of my blog posts, 8 of them in this case. Again, each of them is about 2 pages. It's not that big of a deal to read each of them, and I would really like for all of you to read each and every one of those. And ideally to read a bunch of them before we have our discussion on Thursday. Or in this case, for this module, we're going to have 2 discussions on 2 consecutive Thursdays. All right, so these first few slides are going to get into some overview of what we've gone over so far in the semester, just to kind of try to tie it together and bring it up to the present, and then also to discuss a little bit about what's been done before and to, at least initially here, as it says in this slide, to reject those approaches as having little potential to achieve the improved performance of our school system that we so desperately and urgently need. All right, so we've gone over some of these before. In case you've forgotten what NCLB stands for, that was George W. Bush's follow-up to the Goals 2000 Act. No Child Left Behind is what the letters stand for, enacted towards the end of 2001 as a replacement for the Goals 2000 Act. The Goals 2000 Act having failed to achieve any of its goals in the year 2000. And let it once again, more of the same, harder, the same thing over and over again. You've heard those buzz phrases throughout the semester. It only barely addresses the reasons for failure to adequately engage large numbers of each school students in learning. And so because it keeps doing something that hasn't worked in the past and shows little potential given human nature to work in the future, I cannot label it as transformative. There's still a lot of heroic assumptions alive and well because it takes some policy entrepreneurship to make some fundamental changes to address those, and no one has yet mustered the combination of willpower and wisdom and communication skills to pull that off. I have to tell you, though, I have high hopes that that might be possible in the forthcoming Texas administration. Both the likely Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, and the likely Governor, Greg Abbott, are both pro-school choice, pro-school system change people. So maybe finally we can get some non-discrimination between the use of public and private schools and also a better charter law out of all of that. Again, depending on exactly how you define that, and we can all share the hope that what we think will happen will. It seems more likely that there'll be some leadership on those issues here in the forthcoming legislative session. All right, so back to the slides that you see before you on the screen. The No Child Left Behind Act leaves these long-standing debilitating funding and governance funding practices intact, as it says in the slide. And so it really doesn't fundamentally change anything. As we noted in the recent discussion in the previous module, one thing that it does do beneficially is it gives us a much better idea of how extensive failure is. Maybe that was George Bush's underlying objective, was if he couldn't muster the political will, by that I don't mean his own political will, but the systems, the Congress plus the executive branch together, that couldn't muster sufficient political will to enact legislation that would make a big difference. At least let's get enough data out there so that the public is better aware of how urgently change is needed, and then ultimately that can happen in the more distant future, although again, delay, and we lose more children to adulthood that functions at a lower level than it otherwise might. Again, remember, the problem with low-performing schools isn't so much immediate in terms of economic issues. Most everybody can find something to specialize in and earn a pretty good living. The danger arises, in my opinion, when people aren't aware of the political choices and don't know the difference between good policies and bad policies. They will keep electing people that might be political self-interest, political special interest hacks rather than statesmen and stateswomen, and enact bad policies that might ultimately cripple our economy. And we see some of that already in the fact that the United States economy has fallen from number one in terms of big countries, only behind places like Hong Kong, where we were in the not very distant past, to now where we're 17th in the world. And wow, that's quite a plummet. So those sorts of things, passing legislation that hamstring entrepreneurship and regulate things to a much greater degree than is conducive with economic growth and entrepreneurship that drives it all, there are the dangers if we continue to fail to engage a very large number of children in high-value learning. All right, so because NCLB was more of the same harder, we still continue to have pressures to create schools that everybody pretty much agrees are too big. So why do they keep building them too big? Because, well, we want to address all the diversity that exists in an attendance zone. So we want them to be comprehensive, and politics demands uniformity because the appearance of fairness is paramount. So we keep building huge, comprehensively uniform schools because we don't know of any other way to reasonably seem to deal with the diversity that exists in each attendance zone. All right, so again, continuing with the latest in federal intervention, No Child Left Behind does not end the sorting by age or do anything to encourage sorting children by their interests or abilities in specific subjects or school themes, the kinds of things that we need in order to greatly enhance engagement. Classrooms remain hard to teach, heterogeneous, random samples of local children, making the teaching task as hard as it can be made without having that as an actual objective. Furthermore, because of the increased testing that the No Child Left Behind Act fosters, and with the higher stakes seemingly attached to it, though as you know from Rick Hess and Paul Peterson that we discussed in the last module, actual accountability has not particularly been forthcoming. At least initially it seemed like it might, so it put a lot of pressure on the educators to teach to the test and narrow curriculum to the high stakes tested items, and it put a lot of pressure on the teachers to improve their appearance on the test, which in some case meant that instead of improved teaching, or not just that, they felt pressure to cheat, help their students cheat on the exams. Both happened. The teachers changed answers, the students were given right answers. All of that has happened, and that's a not altogether surprising outcome of much higher stakes, seemingly higher stakes testing. Now, one other thing to note along the way, normally when we increase somebody's responsibility to do something, we also increase their ability to do it. In other words, with responsibility, increased responsibility, normally comes increased control. Unfortunately, we haven't done that in this case. We have put greater pressure on people to produce. If anything, we've reduced their autonomy and increasingly micromanage them, I suppose, not trusting them to perform at a higher level without increasingly prescriptive control of exactly what they do and how they do it. Teachers continue to be stuck with, by definition, politically chosen, politically correct textbooks and curriculum. Again, not allowing them greater autonomy, a greater choice of how to achieve their teaching task, but instead the opposite of increasingly prescriptive language, rules on how they should do their jobs. Okay, so some background, some summary on the need for a transformative vision. This is where we started at the beginning of the semester. Public schools have what I've been calling a public finance monopoly. That means that they get virtually all of the money that everybody pays in school taxes, and that's what I've been calling discrimination, not the kind of discrimination that we're used to based on race or gender, at least hopefully not used to, but hearing about and having defenses against in policy. Public finance monopoly means that the policy discriminates against the families that believe that privately provided schooling options will work better for their children. $13,000 a year is an awful lot. I read recently that teachers can cost over $100,000, including benefits. That's a lot. Teachers are paid $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 in some places. Then plus benefits, you're over $100,000. But do the math. Let's see, 13,000 times, say, 20 kids in a classroom. That's $260,000. So even if we have one of these rather well-funded situations, the teacher making over $100,000 in benefits and salary, that still leaves, let's see, 260,000 minus 100, that still leaves 160,000. About 60% of the money represented by 20 kids in a classroom to be spent on something other than the teacher. All right, so we're spending an awful lot, and of course you know what we're getting, the nation at risk results. Again, let me remind you that doesn't mean that public school isn't working for anybody at all. It just means that it works for not enough of the children, and for those for whom it does work, it costs too much. So we have a public finance monopoly, and as a result of the having to pay twice for private schools, only about 10% of children are enrolled in private schools. The other 90%, 88% public, and 2% homeschooled. And because the system is so heavily weighted towards enrollment in traditional public schools, we have what is called ends-means confusion. Every once in a while you see that in an article that says, look, I read one just the other day, chartered public schools, they are also in that 88%, are about 4% of the kids nationwide. 44% out of that 88%. So this author concluded, even if we were able to double that, which he regarded as unlikely, and frankly, under current circumstances, the chart I'd regarded as unlikely as well, given the price-controlled situation, the unlikelihood of that kind of expansion exists. But okay, so back to this notion of ends-means confusion. Even if we were able to double the 4% to 8%, that would still leave 80% of the kids in traditional public schools, argues this author, which means, by golly, we better make that 80% a lot better. And by the way, I would love to see the 80% or 88% get a lot better. That would be great. But considering the high probability that the existing rules for the operation of traditional public schools and the politically chosen curriculum and books and the single salary schedule for the teachers, given the unlikelihood that all of that centrally planned, virtually ubiquitous nationwide policy is going to come unraveled anytime soon, we might want to assume that the shortest route, well, not assume, we might want to allow for the fact that the shortest route to a better school system is a shrinkage of the public school system to a much smaller than 88%, and an expansion of charter public schools and private schools to pick up the kids for whom the current system is not working particularly well. And I would see, do I want to use the word guarantee? Yeah. I would guarantee you that if we ended the public finance monopoly and ended the discrimination against users of non-public schools, that there would be a very, very rapid expansion in the non-traditional public school enrollment share. How far? My crystal ball doesn't go that far, but 20, 30% for sure, easily, that don't fit very well in the traditional public school scheme would find alternatives, many of which that don't even exist currently, in new and improved private schooling and chartered public schools. And this notion that just because something is 4% current chartered public school share, and that doubling would be unbelievably difficult, yes, under current rules, yes, it would be under the public finance monopoly pricelessness. But under other rules, the private sector can expand very, very rapidly. It doesn't take very long at all to buy a former campus or to build a new one. A year or two, it easily could have 20, 30, 40% market share if that's how many parents in that time frame wanted to switch from traditional public to private. All right, so there's this ends-means confusion because it has a large market share now, and it's assumed that it will into the foreseeable future. And therefore, by golly, we better focus on improving that sector. And again, I'd be thrilled to death to see it improve. But we have to have a plan B that says, well, what if it can't improve? And also, the large market share means that we derive a lot of our knowledge about schooling from that context. And so we believe a lot of things that are true only in that context. They're not necessarily true outside of a system that's 80-something% traditional public and a couple percent charter public and a couple percent homeschooled and 10% strictly private, and under the current system, mostly church-run. All right. So, just a little more background. The tangible incentives within the current system, within the current educators within the current system, to pursue excellence are weak, right? You don't get a raise if you do better. You don't get dinged usually if you aren't outstanding. It's hard to measure. Not so great and not so bad, although I think in most schools everybody knows who the better teachers are. Again, what does better mean in this context? It means better in terms of teaching the official curriculum through the official books and to have a very heterogeneous classroom. A teacher that it currently isn't any good, or maybe not even a person, not even a teacher, might be outstanding at delivering a particular type of pedagogy through a particular type of theme. But if that individual were told, were assigned to a typical traditional public school classroom, random sample of kids about the same age, they might not do all that well. But again, within that context, I think probably most people know within the school who the better teachers are within those circumstances, even though it's hard to document it and define it in top-down accountability, officially measurable terms. Now, this last line on this slide is an important one, but it gives you an understanding of why politically controlled, politically run schooling often struggles to even just to change itself in desired directions when those directions become obvious or compelling. And that's because, by definition, policies are rules. Policies create rules. And you can't create a rule that every child will learn a lot and be brilliant. Those can be goals, and indeed they should be. But you can have rules like there's only 22 kids in a classroom and teachers will be paid this much and they will use these books and this curriculum. Rules trump goals, right? Because you can enforce them. What you can't enforce is the outcome you want. And in many cases, the rules seemingly come in conflict with the goals. For example, a module or two ago, we talked about the controlled choice that's often used to desegregate school systems. Well, what was the conflict there? Well, the rule was the plan to have X% of kids per campus, approximately so, either by choice or previously by busing. And what it turned out was that goal trumped, in many cases, the notion of parents wanting their child in a particular school. And parents, in some cases, were not given their first choice because the rule of the proper racial, ethnic mix per school trumped the parents' notion of which schooling option was best for their child. Okay, just one example of where goals are trumped by rules. And again, you can't enforce excellence. Okay, a couple of other points that we've gone over so far. Don't need to linger too long on this slide because we've gone over these items. Again, I've underlined there, appearance of fairness is paramount. That's what yields uniformity. Appearance of fairness doesn't necessarily mean fair. It just means that it's to look fair. If you treat unlike things like they are not unlike, that's not particularly fair. But that said, the appearance of fairness is paramount. So what we provide to anybody in any school, or provide in any school, has to be provided to everybody in every school. Again, exactly the opposite notion of the specialization that seems to work well in most other parts of the economy, where producers focus in on something where they believe they have comparative advantage. They leave other things to other people. You go into their store and it turns out you want something different than they have, and they refer you one of their competitors, sort of a competitor, produces sort of the same thing, not exactly the same thing, so they're sort of competitors, but not exactly. So, lost my train of thought there. Good break for a sip of water. My mouth dries up pretty fast. All right, so this uniformity is exactly the opposite of what happens in most industry, which is specialization, according to comparative advantage by the producers, and then the customers, in case of schools, that would be the parents and the children, sort themselves out among the producers that are doing different things in different ways according to their own preferences, how they learn and what they learn best. Okay, so again, we have a little bit of more background here. The shaky foundations of the current system, we've gone over these already. If you've seen my email recently, you know that I've got a new bottom line there to my auto signature, something I'm sort of honing into a message. Goes along here with my first bullet on this slide. But again, these are not assertions. These are, with all the questions marked, these are heroic assumptions. Okay, and I put all those questions marked there to highlight the fact that the system implicitly assumes these things, and that these are heroic assumptions. Right? No other industry that I know of has ever fared very well for very long without market-driven price signals. Yet, it's not part of the school system we have, except distorted in the private sector. Yeah, there's tuition in the private sector. Yeah, it's market determined, but it's a very distorted price in the private sector, distorted by the fact that they're competing against something that's provided at no additional charge beyond the taxes that everybody has to pay. All right, so we're assuming heroically that price signals are unimportant. We're assuming heroically that schooling, by we, I mean the protectors of the system, and by that, and frankly also the vast majority of those folks that are in the business of proposing alternatives. That's why I'm honing that message that I've got at the bottom of my auto signature now, is I want to get through to them two choices. Either make the case, convince yourself that schooling is in fact the one industry, the first ever, that's likely to fare well long term without market-driven price signals to inform and motivate the producers and the consumers. And if you can't do that, then by golly, if you can't convince yourself that schooling is in fact likely to be, and I say to be because it has not been so far, it is likely to be in some way successful while still remaining price controlled. If you can't do that, then by golly, you ought to be working on some way to effect price decontrol, some politically feasible way that introduces market-driven price signals to get away from this heroic assumption that price control can work for K through 12 schooling. All right, so maybe you can help me. Maybe in our classroom discussion we can talk about how to take that statement at the bottom of my email auto signature and to revise it and change it to make it more powerful and more compelling so that the people who read it, especially those that are involved in school system reform, can choose whether they can make that case. They may have never even thought about it, can make that case that, yeah, that a price control can still work, can be made to be okay for schooling, or, no, I don't think it can be. We better get to work on effecting decontrol. I look forward to that. And we have two Thursdays coming up here that we can devote some of to that. And then there's the next heroic assumption. The monopoly status enhances efficiency. So in other words, if we give one set of schools the advantage of not having to charge anything to have a pretty substantial budget, $13,000 per child, that we think that will make the school system more efficient, or perhaps I've overstated my 4 question mark statement there. Maybe the goal isn't just efficiency, but okay, well maybe the efficiency could be higher, but it's because it's free, it's the most equitable. Or read one of the blog posts that says that free only is an equity failure, one of the ones that I've assigned for this module. And in any event, certainly it's a heroic assumption that monopoly status enhances efficiency. That's just one of the classic market failures when it exists, when there isn't enough market entry, when the market is closed or hard to enter, and or when there aren't enough producers and consumers, therefore not enough competition. That leads to problems in the marketplace. Prices too high, quality too low, too little produced. You remember that from some of your other economics courses. Perhaps the biggest whopper of all that's an implicit assumption there is my third bullet. Incentives don't matter. It's amazing to me when I point this out that some people just go right by this notion, yeah, there isn't any incentive to tangible incentive to be an effective educator, and there's no reward. You're on your single salary schedule. You get a raise when you get older if you can get it, or if you can get another degree, but your actual performance isn't going to affect your income. And the people that I bring this, that I share this with, somehow can just go right by that and somehow imagine, heroically assume, given the human nature that they see all around them, that we can get outstanding performance in the system without properly directed incentives for those who make their living in it, and frankly, for that matter, for the parents and the children as well. I mean, the parents don't have much incentive to be involved in their education as they probably should be. Why? Because most of the things that they might want to have an influence over are decided by policy and aren't available for them to influence. And so many of them just say, there's nothing I can do about X, Y, and Z. I don't have the money to send my kid to private school. Off to public school he goes, and boy, I sure hope it turns out well. Okay, and then fourth bullet there, we've talked about this extensively. It's obvious that children are different, and the way that we should handle that, again, heroically assuming that, which has been proven wrong repeatedly, that specialization within a large uniform conglomerate organization, a giant shopping mall school, is the best way to handle the diversity of children, and frankly also the diversity of educators, and that's better than specialization in ways to do things or themes to engage both educators and children in the instructional process. That's better than that way of doing things, which is the norm for most, maybe all, well, let's stick to most industries' way of doing things. Another heroic assumption, I think I've assigned you the Hanushek article earlier in the semester. What if there are no best practices? But basically we are assuming implicitly. I'm not sure anybody would come right out and say this. Occasionally, someone comes out and says, "Yeah, this is working great, and we should make all the schools do this." And then when they find out that it won't work for all the schools, whoops, that wasted a few years and hopes and dreams, and moving on to find the silver bullet and some other thing that might hopefully be the best practice that can be used in all the comprehensively uniform schools to teach nearly all the children pretty much the same thing. So we're assuming there are best practices, that one size, at least in some respects, can fit nearly all, and that the political process will discover those best practices and implement. That might be the most heroic part of that assumption of all. I've mentioned articles, I'm not sure I've assigned them, by Ahrens and McCluskey, that talk about the difficult process for implementing different kinds of things into textbooks and curriculum. So there's no guarantee that when we discover things, that they're the right things, or that we can implement them. And then last but not least, another bulleted item. Not sure why I didn't bullet the other items on this slide. A particularly pervasive and annoying and devastatingly distracting and assumption that there are good schools and good teachers and bad teachers, that these statements that nearly everybody makes are useful ways to discuss these issues, and they're not. Human talent, children, schools can be multidimensional and can work well for some circumstances, for some educators, for some children, some of the time, but not for everybody all the time. Again, getting back to that notion of best practices. Yes, there are a lot of best practices that work well for a lot of children when delivered by certain educators, trained in doing certain things, passionate about doing certain things, but may not, even when delivered by those educators, work very well for all children, or even a large minority of them, but maybe a significant minority of them. All right, so now we're up to the point where I can actually get into putting some of the pieces together that you're already aware of. So the first thing to do in terms of that is to define the goal. Well, we want rapid improvement, okay, not just getting to a certain point. We want to keep getting better and better. We want rapid improvement in the important things children can know and do. Not just anything, not just some things, but they have to be the most important things. I mean, we can't teach the kids everything, right? And we have to have a mixture of teaching them skills and knowledge. So we have to have not just a process of teaching, but a process of deciding what we should be teaching and where and how and what the mix should be. And that's why I keep saying we need a price system, because it's impossible for central planners to know exactly what the right mix of pedagogies and themes and other things should be, and where they should be. That's something that can be discovered through the price system by entrepreneurs. And there has to, there's some give and take in that process. Namely, things are tried and they don't work, and they have to be shut down, and then this resources go to other things. But that's better. Some churn is better than being stuck in a rut and keep assigning kids to things, to schools that don't work well for anybody at all in some cases, or in other cases work okay for some kids at an unnecessarily high cost and don't work at all for other kids. All right, so this goal is all about ends and is indifferent to means. In other words, I don't know, and I don't care how we accomplish this rapid improvement, and whether it's done through private schools or public schools or charter schools or church-run schools or profit-run schools. It doesn't matter. And what matters is that we have a price system to inform and motivate producers and consumers of these choices, and that it keeps getting better and better in engaging children in high-value learning. Okay, now there always are trade-offs, but I think they've been overblown to some extent. The notion that there are market failures, right? That schooling is a merit good, it will lead to underconsumption, and so on and so forth, that we've discussed in the past. Yeah, but I'm not sure that the trade-offs are that large. For example, we discussed the fact that, yes, there's likely to be some underconsumption of schooling because of this merit good notion, the spillovers that come to society. But the underconsumption is not likely to be in the areas most important to society at large. According to E.G. West and Milton Friedman and others, James Tooley, and I agree with them, having read their work, and others that disagree, the most important thing for the public-mindedness, the citizenship, participation in the political process, not the only important thing, but the most important thing is for people to have basic skills so that they can read and write, so that they can take part in public discourse, right? Write a good letter to their editor, write a good letter to their representative in the state or in the Congress, those sorts of things, that they can articulate what they believe in, they can process numbers so that they can check whether things add up and whether they make sense, that they can do these things on their own. That's much more important than the civics course that they might have missed out on, if that's the one, something that they miss out on if schooling isn't subsidized. Jumping ahead a little bit, I do believe it should be subsidized, so to me that's not really a huge issue. Yes, there are some trade-offs, but I think that they've probably been overblown a little bit. They're not as severe as some scholars allege them to be, but definitely this is an area of considerable controversy, and it's an area where we need to do some more work while we have the time, whether we want it or not. In other words, while we're still dithering around deciding what to do and how to do it, we have time to put the ideas and evidence and information on the table for a lot of these things until we amass both the political wisdom and will to move forward in light of the dire consequences of staying where we are versus the risk of moving forward with less than all the information we'd like to have. All right, so proven, indirect evidence, proven in other market settings, all market settings. We need dynamic price signals. Again, that means that the prices of things change in response to supply and demand. Part of supply isn't just some producers producing more, but it's market entry enticed by profit potential. That profit potential creates copycat entrepreneurship, and that increases the supply and drives down prices. Of course, the converse is true. If losses are mounting, as they are sadly for some charter public schools, sooner or later the consequence is market exit and then higher prices for those that remain. All right, and so also again proven prerequisite is we can't, even if there are a large number of producers, we can't close the market and say, it's competitive enough, there's a lot of producers in there, a lot of consumers. No, we always need to be open to additional producers to replace those who may have become lackadaisical and may be able to survive still, but somebody new might be able to do more and better. So always need to have low entry barriers so that the newcomers coming along can lean on, push, and in some cases replace existing producers, even in what might be argued is already a competitive market. And we need division of labor. We need specialization within schools, and that comprehensively uniform. Yeah, we should. Yeah, we need some specialization within schools. And until we change the system enough to allow for specialization by schools and a more level playing field between public and private, that's all we're going to have. But in any event, we need to foster as much as possible educators doing their craft according to their comparative advantage, which the market helps them find by making them successful at what they do best and not competitive when they do something in which they don't have a comparative advantage where someone else can do it better, even if they can do it okay. Someone else does it better, and they have to stick to what they're best at. Okay, now we're back to a couple of, sort of repeat confessions. Remember, first slide, points A and B about evidence is thin, yeah, but there's this delay issue while we're waiting for more evidence. Another thing to keep in the back of your mind as you do your readings and hopefully participate in the discussions, even once you have evidence, they're subject to interpretation. Okay, so having evidence doesn't settle the issues necessarily. It may help, but they're subject to interpretation. And that's certainly true in this area, where a lot of people are great at producing evidence, but don't have any idea what they mean. It's another area of specialization. Some of us may be specialized in figuring out what happened and who did what, and be really good at ferreting out those facts, and then other people may have no ability to do that all, or at least not be competitive in that way. That might not be their comparative advantage. But put the facts on the table, and they'll be much better at figuring out what they actually mean or what they might mean. And again, several people having that discerning what the evidence means might still reach different conclusions. So facts, evidence are subject to interpretation. It's one thing to say what is, it's another thing to say what to do about it. Okay, and then assumptions amount to hypotheses founded on indirect evidence and allegedly relevant theories. So yeah, it's one thing to have evidence and facts, and then you move forward, you still need to have some assumptions. As budding young economists, you know that better than anybody else. You can't do much of anything research-wise or entrepreneurial-wise without wisely chosen assumptions. They may prove to be heroic, but where do these assumptions come from? At least initially, the ones that you choose to rely on from indirect evidence. Again, that's the basis of entrepreneurship, is you have indirect evidence that you extend to new areas and try to do something entrepreneurial. Again, but in this case, by the way, I'm not talking about that copycat entrepreneurship. There you're operating on direct evidence. Somebody's making big bucks doing X. The kind of entrepreneurship I'm talking about is doing something new, doing something no one else has tried before. On what basis do you do such things? On the basis of assumptions developed from indirect evidence and the theories that you believe to be relevant. But as it says there in the bottom of that slide, they ultimately do amount to hypotheses, because the indirect evidence may not be appropriate to the new setting in which it's being applied. And so the hypothesis embedded in using that indirect evidence may be proven false in the new setting in which it is being tried. All right, so with that challenge to present different interpretations and perspectives, here are the key policy changes. And by the way, you can see I'm running up to about an hour. I'm going to stop here in a couple minutes before we get into how we implement these. I'll do that video next Monday and put it up on Module 7 as soon as it's made available to me. All right, so we started off talking about NCLB and all the testing that it does. I'm not against testing. One of the things we need some testing for is so that scholars, people like me who are interested in trying to figure out what the best school system is, and to further hone our notion of where we should go from here, my vision, need testing in order to generate the ability to compare school systems and figure out why some school systems produce better results than others, to create that data that I need and others need to ferret out what the determinants are of high and low performance. So we need testing for system comparison, which means different systems need to have some common tests so we can compare them. And also we need some basic skills testing to inform parental choice making. And bottom-up accountability, that's what parents will do to choose a school for their child or children. They'll take that basic skills testing into account with all the other things in which that describe differences in the schools that they have available to them to make a choice. So the basic skills testing will be just one ingredient that most parents will use to make a choice about what school to place their children in. Okay, so kind of going along with scholars needing to do research to figure out why some school systems are better than others. After developing the data from the testing and other sorts of data that we need in order to make those comparisons, we need user-friendly provision of data. This is clearly an area where the government could, although not necessarily, be active. It is already active in this area, in the National Center for Education Statistics and other arenas that government provided data. But we need We need an expansion of those data, and especially an ability to compare school systems. So we need multiple measures of whole system performance, and explain what that means. Whole system. It's easy to get data for the public school system. But what we need to understand is whether the whole system is improved or deteriorated or made worse by certain changes in school systems, funding and governance policies. And so we need data that describe the performance of the whole system, public and private combined, not just the public system. One of the things that we have now, because we have mostly just public school system data, is focus on what can we do to make the public school system better, which again is fine in and of itself, but we can't rely just on that. We have to have a plan B that says, what if the public school system were like all the other major producers of just about anything over time, namely that after a while they grow stagnant and need replacement. It's the way most industries have gone, as the dominant producers don't survive for all time. They are replaced by something new and better that the culture of the big firm that was dominant didn't allow them to adopt, and so they withered away eventually. So we need data for the whole system so we can allow for the fact that some of the things that make school systems better, maybe all of them, are things that will not make the public school system any better, although indirectly it can be made better just by getting the outliers, those for whom the system is not working very well, out of there, and then the remaining children can do better when the outliers are no longer in their classrooms disrupting things and distracting their teachers, getting their teachers to try to do multiple things for multiple children. More homogeneous classroom settings are more teachable. And again, somewhat self-serving. Yeah, I want more money too, so source of research grants. A clearinghouse for the studies that are provided for by these grants and by other sources, and an overview of findings that's as objective as it can possibly be. And then last but not least, definitely not least, because this will motivate our discussion in the next couple of Thursdays here, we need to end the public finance monopoly. That means we need a high minimum subsidy. Yes, a subsidy, for reasons that I've given, summarized them here. We have that cash flow problem, remember? If you have a bunch of kids in school all at once, having to finance them all privately can be very, very difficult. That can lead to some serious underconsumption of schooling. So what we need is a high minimum amount, $7, $8, $9, $10, $11,000, something like that, a non-discriminatory level, portable. Every child has money attached to him or her, whatever school their parent chooses for them. That's where that money will go. That's what I mean by non-discriminatory. Can it be the full amount? Can it be just the public funding divided by the number of children? Probably not. That's probably a little too simple. First of all, we need to have some money from the taxes to pay off the debts, or for debt service for the public school districts. And then we probably need to fund some children at higher levels than others as sort of a starting point before allowing parents to add on to them. Special needs kids, for example, that may be very costly. Society has decided that shouldn't all be on the parents. And so the high minimum might need to vary from among children based on age. Older kids are harder to finance than younger kids, and also by some special needs issue. But it must be possible to avoid price control and to get the parents to have some skin in the game. Must be possible, and perhaps even mandatory for parents to add on to that, for shared financing, as I've called it, or co-payment, as the Supreme Court Zellman decision calls it. So, again, that cash flow assistance issue that I mentioned just a moment ago, $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 privately per kid with a bunch of kids in school at the same time, could really put a dent in the budget. Maybe it would be better to pay for a lot of schooling throughout your lifetime through taxes, and then while your kid's in school, have the possibility, either by your own funding or through third parties, to top off that public funding with some additional money. And so that direct payment margin, either to be financed through third parties by having to apply for scholarships or out of your own budget, that is necessary to avoid price control and also to get the parents to have some skin in the game. When things are free, they're often disrespected for being free. As Mitt Romney said, actually, in the last campaign, I was stunned. One of the reasons maybe that he lost, he says everybody's got to pay, which means that if you're not paying any taxes now, I'm going to change that so that everybody pays at least a little bit. And that's right. Everybody needs to have some skin in the game for government expenses generally or for schooling. And then the question is, well, how exactly do we do that? Well, that's one of the things that we can legitimately argue about and differ on, and there's room for disagreement on that without destroying the underlying need to provide for the skin in the game and to allow for prices to be set by market forces. Why not means test this high minimum level of funding? Everybody pays their taxes, and the notion that some people are rich is certainly true, but there are relatively few truly rich people. If you have a two-worker professional family, you're probably rich in the top 10 or 15 or 20%. Yet a couple of tuitions for your kids all at one time, that would be severely stressful on your budget. So everybody pays their taxes. They should be entitled to a piece of their own taxes to finance their kids, even if they are truly rich, and not very many people are. I believe the last time I looked at the data, if you are making over $80,000 in your household, again, two professionals combined easily hits that. You're rich. You're in the top 10%. So let's not worry about whether the rich gain from getting some of their own money back. They're paying most of the taxes. Let's make it universal, and it's fair that everybody gets some direct return on their own school taxes, and that we avoid the hassle and the possible injustice of means testing the money more than we normally would just by everybody getting the same amount, even though they don't pay the same amount in taxes. It's a truism, as Milton Friedman heard in a debate one time with a public official, and he later acknowledged that it was in fact correct. Politics is such that programs targeted the poor because of the low participation in politics of lower income people typically become neglected, poor programs. So it's another reason to have it be universal, to have everybody have some political skin in the game. Don't target it at the poor. And also, if we target at the poor, we reduce competition and the potential for specialization, which is fundamental to the system producing the results that we need. I think I'm going to leave it right here until next time. We have a little bit more to go in this module, but I've been talking for an hour. I'm running dry, and I better cut it off here, and we'll pick this up with the rest of this module for next week.